I want to begin by dedicating my remarks to the memory of my beloved friend and your leader, the servant of God, Christoph Arnold. Like many of you, perhaps all of you, I learned a lot from Pastor Arnold about the most important things that I'll be talking a bit about in my remarks this morning. Jesus, love, courage. Christoph was a prophet, and I'll be talking a bit about prophets too. I'm honored and delighted to be with you on this joyous occasion to celebrate all that you have together achieved. Credit, of course, goes first to you, the graduates, for your hard work and dedication. Today is, above all, your day, even those of you who don't have birthdays today. But these graduates, my friends, like their peers at schools across the country, have benefited enormously from the tireless and selfless efforts of their teachers and from the unwavering support of their parents and other relatives and friends. If my 33 years as a professor have taught me anything, it's that education, learning, is anything but a solo enterprise. Rather, it's a cooperative endeavor. The student is at the center, and there's no substitute for his or her efforts, but teachers, parents, grandparents, and others all play crucial roles. A student's educational attainments are partly the achievements of the teachers and the parents and the grandparents and the brothers and sisters and the friends as well. So in my opinion, a commencement ceremony like this one is a time to honor and celebrate parents and teachers and friends and grandparents, even as we honor and celebrate the students whom they've taught and helped and supported. My young friends, on June 8th, 1978, 40 years ago, this very day, a man with a craggy face and a beard came to Harvard University, where I was then a graduate student, to give their annual commencement address. The man was not a Harvard graduate. He was not a professor. He was not an American. He did not speak English. His address, given in his native Russian with simultaneous English translation, was not especially well received. I suspect that Harvard officials regretted their decision to invite the man to speak at commencement. The man's name was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I believe you've read some of his work. He was a brilliant novelist and essayist who had spent several years as a political prisoner in what you know was called the Gulag in the Soviet Union. He was a strong Orthodox Christian and a fierce critic of atheistic communism and Soviet tyranny. His writings had exposed the corruption, the cruelty, the injustice of the communist regime that had come to power in Russia in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and would remain in power for more than 70 years, a regime that would enslave its own people and reduce the people of many other nations, such as Hungary, to serfdom under Soviet puppet governments. A regime as totalitarian and as murderous as the Nazi regime in Germany that the U.S. and Britain had allied with the Soviets to defeat in the Second World War. Now, in 1978, what was called the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was raging, and the United States was still reeling from its humiliation in the disastrous war in Vietnam. Anti-Americanism was flourishing both abroad and at home. Many Americans, particularly young Americans, had lost faith in their country, in its institutions, in its principles, its culture, its traditions, its way of life. Some were proposing communism as a superior system. Many were suggesting what came to be known as moral equivalency between American democracy and Soviet communism. By 1978, to suggest such equivalency had become a mark of sophistication, something that distinguished the person suggesting it from the allegedly nativist Hicks and Rubes, who believed in the superiority of the American to the Soviet system. There were many such sophisticated people at Harvard, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn came to Harvard to confront them and others. His speech, however, was not an encomium to America or to the West. On the contrary, it was a searing, severe critique, one might even say a prophetic rebuke and a warning. Of course, Solzhenitsyn did not argue for the moral equivalency, much less the superiority of the Soviet system. He hated communism in all its dimensions, and he loathed the gangsters who ruled the Soviet empire. What he faulted America, and the West more generally, for was rather its abandonment of its own moral and especially spiritual ideals and identity. He viewed the West's weakness, including its weakness in truly standing up to Soviet aggression, as the fruit of the materialism, consumerism, self-indulgent individualism, emotivism, and narcissism, in a word, the immorality into which we had allowed ourselves to sink in our wealth and pride. Solzhenitsyn, the by then legendary human rights activist, warned America and the West that we had become too focused on human rights and needed to recenter our focus on human obligations, our moral and spiritual duties. We had come to embrace a false idea of freedom, conceiving it merely as doing what one pleases, rather than as the liberty to fulfill one's human potential and to honor one's conscientious duties to God and neighbor. At the heart of this moral confusion and collapse, Solzhenitsyn argued, was a loss of faith. And together with the loss of faith, the loss of the virtue of courage. Let me quote to you Solzhenitsyn's own words from the Harvard address. A decline in courage may be the most striking feature which an outside observer notices in the West in our days. The Western world has lost its civil courage, both as a whole and separately in each country, each government, each political party, and of course in the United Nations. Such a decline in courage is particularly noticeable among the ruling groups and intellectual elite, causing an impression of the loss of courage by the entire society. Of course, there are many courageous individuals, but they have no determining influence on public policy, unquote. I submit to you today that despite the American victory in the Cold War, for which we should all be grateful, and despite the collapse and disappearance of the Soviet Union, nothing has changed in Solzhenitsyn's critique and its relevance to us in the West today. The virtue we lack, and it is an indispensable virtue, is courage. And we must recover it. You, our young men and women, must regain it, not to defend us from a hostile foreign power armed with nuclear weapons, but to protect us from a far more dangerous foe, a truly deadly enemy. That is, our own worst selves. At all times and in all places, all of the virtues are needed. No virtue is superfluous or dispensable. But it seems that at any given time, in any particular society, there is a particular virtue that is lacking and therefore desperately needed. Moreover, because the virtues are integrally connected to each other, they're like a network, the loss of any one virtue tends to weaken and thus imperil all the other virtues. That's how it works. Or worse, the loss of a given virtue threatens to turn other virtues into engines of vice. Let me explain what I mean. Take, for example, the wonderful, indispensable virtue of compassion. Compassion is an essential virtue, like the others. It can move us to work selflessly and even heroically for the good of our fellow human beings, especially those who are needy and suffering. We cannot do without the virtue of compassion. We rightly praise the compassionate for their good deeds in caring for the least and the last and the lost. But consider, my young friends, what can happen when compassion remains strong, but other virtues, such as love of truth, such as justice, such as patience, have eroded or disappeared. Operating by itself, in isolation from the other virtues, compassion can motivate every manner of evil, from the killing of the unborn in abortion to the killing of the disabled and the frail elderly in euthanasia. We can convince ourselves that kindness calls for these things. Well before the Nazis gave eugenics a bad name, well-intentioned, decent, compassionate people in places like Germany and England and the United States embraced eugenics precisely out of a sense of compassion. You must understand, the Nazis did not invent it. It was invented by people in the Weimar democracy and in the United States and in England a decade and more before the rise of the Nazis. It was polite, sophisticated, well-educated non-Nazis like Binding and Hoxha, a law professor and a medical professor, who wrote the book defending the killing of the Lebenswürdiges Leben, lives unworthy of life. The Nazis then took it and ran with it, but don't deceive yourselves about who invented it. It was invented by compassionate people whose compassion had become isolated from other essential virtues. And so they supported things like mandatory sterilization for some classes of persons, and even mercy killing for some persons whose lives were deemed inferior, burdensome, not worth living. Another fact of history, perhaps you know it, the killing by the Nazis did not begin with the killing of the Jews or the gypsies or the political opponents. It began with killing the handicapped, the disabled, the cognitively impaired. That's how it began. We ourselves live at a time of great moral confusion. If anything, our situation is worse today than it was in Solzhenitsyn's time when he visited Harvard in 1978. There has been, to borrow a concept from the atheist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, a transvaluation of values in many spheres. What is good is sometimes redefined now as bad. What is bad is redefined now as good. Verena told you the truth when she said in her brief remarks a moment ago, you know what is good, you know what is bad. Hold fast to what is good. Don't be deceived. Don't be lured into redefining good as bad and bad as good. To defend the conjugal understanding of marriage as the union of husband and wife and traditional ideas about sexuality and morality comes at a price these days. You'll be called a hater. To welcome the migrant and the refugee is to court being accused of disloyalty to your country. To stand up for the sanctity of life in all stages and conditions, beginning with the defense of the precious and vulnerable child in the womb, is to risk being labeled a misogynist. To speak out for religious freedom and the rights of conscience is to invite being smeared as a bigot. That's why courage is needed, to stand fast, as Verena urged you to do, to what you know is good and what you know is true. That's why you have to heed Jacob's advice. Stay close to Jesus. Only when you stay close to Jesus are you safe from being lured into error. Now, it's not pleasant to be subjected to what you will be subjected to if you stand fast to the right. And these days, it goes beyond mere unpleasantness, being called names. To speak moral truth to cultural power is to put at risk one's social standing, one's educational and employment opportunities, one's professional advancement. It can be to place in jeopardy treasured friendships and sometimes even familial relationships. And the more people in reaction to these threats acquiesce or go silent, the more dangerous and therefore more difficult it becomes for anyone to speak the truth out loud, even if they know it in their hearts. Anyone who succumbs to the intimidation and bullying, anyone who acquiesces or goes silent out of fear, not only harms his or her own character and fails in his or her Christian duty to bear faithful witness to truth, he or she also makes things harder for others. We owe it not only to ourselves to be courageous, we owe it to our brothers and sisters too. And because we owe it to ourselves and others, we owe it to God. Our own worst selves, our ultimate enemies, our most dangerous foe, our own worst selves are our unvirtuous selves. Our own worst selves are ourselves when we lack the self-mastery that possession of the virtues, including the virtue of courage, makes possible. Our own worst selves are slaves, not to alien masters, but to our own weaknesses and wayward desires. Our own worst selves are what we encouraged or are encouraged by so much in our culture today to be. And when we are our own worst selves, what we seek are ephemeral and ultimately meaningless things like pleasure, status, social acceptability, wealth, power, celebrity. Things that aren't bad in themselves, since they can be used for good ends, but things that are not good in themselves, but can lure us into supposing they are and acting as if they are. When we are our own worst selves, we fail in our duty to bear faithful witness because a desire for ephemeral things and a fear of losing them paralyzes us. When we are our own worst selves, we lead lives that are marked by those vices against which Solzhenitsyn railed 40 years ago: materialism, consumerism, self-indulgence, narcissism. We place our focus on doing as we please, no matter what we please, getting what we want, no matter what it is we happen to want, instead of seeking what is true because it's true, what is good because it's good, what is right because it's right. Instead, we seek what we desire for no better reason other than we desire it. Indeed, we fall into the profound moral and philosophical error of imagining that the human good consists in the satisfaction of human desires, and then it quickly becomes all about me, 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 and me. That is not the Christian life. That is not a truly human way of living. Thus it is that we rationalize behavior. We rationalize acting like brute animals, not like rational creatures. We become slaves of our passions. And of course, by definition, slaves to passions can never be masters of themselves. And no one who lacks self-mastery can practice and exemplify the virtue of courage. Courage always, always presupposes a willingness to sacrifice oneself for others or for something higher. Someone who is not master of himself, someone who cannot rise above his own wants and desires and passions, can never give himself to someone else, give himself to God, give himself to the community. Self-mastery is a precondition of the willingness and ability to live self-sacrificially, as Jesus lived and as Jesus taught us to live. One cannot give oneself to others if one is not master of oneself first. Lacking self-mastery, one simply has nothing to give. The Christian story, my friends, is all about self-giving, self-sacrificial living and dying. God himself sends his only begotten Son to us in our sinfulness to be our Redeemer and Savior by a supreme act of self-sacrificial love, dying on a cross. We as disciples of Jesus are to model our lives on his, emptying and sacrificing ourselves for others, bearing witness to truth, no matter the cost. Now, a few minutes ago, I suggested that Solzhenitsyn saw a deep connection between the decline of courage and a loss of faith. 5 years after his Harvard address, in a 1983 speech accepting the Templeton Prize in Religion, Solzhenitsyn stated this in even more explicit terms. The very title of the speech made his point clear. The title was, "Men Have Forgotten God." Now here is its opening paragraph. Quote, "As a survivor of the communist Holocaust, I am horrified to witness how my beloved America, my adopted country, is gradually being transformed into a secularist and atheistic utopia where communist ideals are glorified and promoted, while Judeo-Christian values and morality are ridiculed and increasingly eradicated from the public and social consciousness of our nation. Under the decades-long assault and militant radicalism of so many so-called liberal and progressive elites, God has progressively been erased from our public and educational institutions to be replaced with all manner of delusion, perversion, corruption, violence, decadence, and insanity." Unquote. Now, 35 years later, who can deny the truth of Solzhenitsyn's anguished lament? People did not want to hear it then. They are no more eager to hear it now. Today, the cultured despisers of Christianity and Judeo-Christian morality do not speak of communism or its ideals, communism having been discredited by Soviet gangsterism. They speak instead of things like liberation or a false view of equality, by which they seek to marginalize and stigmatize principles of Judeo-Christian morality and justify acts and practices that contravene those principles. And they are certainly aggressive, moving, to cite one from many possible examples, from the legalization of abortion to the demand for its approval in public funding to the insistence that institutions or people, including religious institutions such as Catholic hospitals, counsel for abortions or even perform abortions. Now, what's behind all this? According to Solzhenitsyn, the moral decline of the West has behind it the same factor that produced the horrors of communism, namely this: men have forgotten God. You know, when people forget God, it's not that they worship nothing. It's that they worship themselves. They deify their own desires. They fall into an idolatry of the self. It's the me thing. Because they have forgotten that there is something, indeed someone, higher than the self, more important than my desires or wishes or goals or ambitions. We have forgotten God. And absent faith in God, how can we muster the courage to bear bold witness, as Solzhenitsyn himself did, to Christian values in an increasingly hostile culture and world? How can there be courage in the absence of faith? There cannot be. And that's because fear is a very, very powerful emotion. We've all felt it. We know how powerful fear is. What can overcome it? Almost nothing. Only one thing: faith. When people forget God, when they come to suppose that they don't need Him, they don't need His grace, they don't need His guidance, when we fall into the hubristic error of imagining that we are too smart or sophisticated to believe in God, a catastrophe always ensues, just as it did in Russia. Now, this was no novel insight or discovery of Solzhenitsyn's. It's the central teaching and theme of the prophets, all prophets, and not just the biblical ones, though certainly it was their central teaching and theme. If I can take you back another 155 years, in March of 1863, another man with a craggy face and a beard spoke to the American people words of critique and prophetic warning of precisely the sort Solzhenitsyn spoke at Harvard and in his Templeton address. President Lincoln, reflecting on the catastrophe of the Civil War, 750,000 dead men, and on the causes of the war, issued in March of 1863 a proclamation of a national day of prayer and fasting. What he said in that proclamation, and I commend to you reading the whole thing, go online and look it up, the Proclamation of Prayer and Fasting of 1863. What he said was echoed by Solzhenitsyn, and we would do well to heed it today. Indeed, we fail to heed it at our mortal peril. Here are Lincoln's words, if I may quote him. Whereas it is the duty of nations as well as men to own their dependence upon the overruling power of God and to confess their sins and transgressions in humble sorrow, yet with assured hope that genuine repentance will lead to mercy and pardon, and to recognize the sublime truth announced in all the Holy Scriptures and proved by all of history, that those nations only are blessed whose God is the Lord. And inasmuch as we know that by his divine law, nations, like individuals, are subjected to punishments and chastisements in this world, may we not justly fear that the awful calamity of civil war, which now desolates our land, may be but a punishment inflicted upon us for our presumptuous sins, to the needful end of our national reformation as a whole people. Lincoln goes on, we have been recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of a redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God who made us. This was Lincoln 155 years ago, a message identical to Solzhenitsyn's message 40 years ago this very day, and a message as relevant to us as it has ever been in our country. Yes, as a culture, as a people, we have forgotten God. That is reflected in our laws, in the edicts of the Supreme Court, in our public policies, in our news and entertainment media, in our schools and our universities, on our streets, and too often, even in our homes. We have indeed vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that our blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. And as a result, we find ourselves in the condition so accurately and brutally diagnosed by Solzhenitsyn. But young men and women, to you especially now I direct these words. What has been forgotten can be remembered. What has fallen into decay can be renewed. What has been lost can be rediscovered. But for these things to happen, those who do remember God and who sincerely seek to do his will must look to him and call upon him for the grace necessary to be his courageous and faithful witnesses, to be, in the words of another modern prophet, Pope John Paul II, signs of contradiction to a world that has indeed forgotten God. This allows me humbly to say that it is your mission to remember God and to bear courageous witness. You must remember God to a world that has forgotten him. By the examples of your lives, the example of the lives you lead, as well as by the words of your mouth, you must be the salt and the light that repairs what is broken and points the way to true freedom for those who have fallen into forms of slavery that are all the more abject for masquerading as liberation. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to be with you, and God bless each and every one of you. Stand fast to the right.